Hey, welcome back to the color page. Today we're talking about the curves that you can find in the color page of DaVinci. The first one is the basic custom curves. The bottom left part represents the shadows, the top right part represents the highlights, everything that is in the middle represents the midtones. In order to create the contrast in your image, you can drag the left portion down, the right portion up. In this way, you're crashing your shadows, you're reducing the brightness in the shadow, and you increasing the brightness in the highlights, thus creating the contrast. If you remember, I was talking that dragging contrast from left to right, thus increasing it, will create the same effect as if I were doing something like this. But there is actually many curves in here that we are going to talk about, so let's get going. First of all, let's have a look at the menu option. You can add default anchors. If it is easier for you to work this way, you can add these anchors, and this way this whole line will be subdivided into 5 sectors. As before, nothing has changed. The top right represents highlights, the bottom left shadows, but it is maybe just a little bit easier for you because, as you can see, when I'm dragging this particular point, the other two, they remain at their constant position, thus making it easier for you to fine-tune your curve. But be careful, if you create like drastic changes, it's gonna break any colors in your image. Also, you can enable editable splines. What is editable splines? If you click on any point, you can actually create a point in here, but it is more logical to do it this way. If you click on any point, you got handles now. And this way you can fine-tune and it is easier to control the controls in here. You're gonna drag these handles towards the upper part of this whole area and the left part towards the bottom part, thus creating contrast, but in a much more controlled way than before. And don't forget to disable them once you are done. As you can see, we can view histogram right in the curves, but when I change the parameters within the curves, nothing is really changing within this histogram. This is because it is feeding the histogram of our original image. If you want to view what you are doing to the histogram, you need to go to the settings, histograms, and change it to output. Now, if I change something, we can view its effect on a histogram. By default, this line is ganked. It means that Y, R, G, and B channels are linked with each other. And when I put a dot in here, I changed something. I change the brightness values, the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel simultaneously. If you want to control them separately, you need to unlink them. Then this is for luminance, for Y. This is red, green, and blue. And this way you can color grade it like you are doing something in your primary color wheels. For example, I can reduce the amount of green in the shadows and increase the amount of green in the highlights. The same thing I can do to any color that is in here. So if you need fine control, you can unlink them in here. Now, below this linking area, we have sliders. And these sliders allow us to control the intensity of the effect that we are doing. For example, I'm creating a point in here and crushing my shadows, reducing my shadows. And I do not want this effect to be this drastic, so this is like an opacity. I can just reduce the opacity of this effect, thus making it like a little bit weaker. You can also unlink them and reduce the intensity of channels separately. For example, I'm reducing the intensity of red channel, or I'm reducing the intensity of the green channel, and so on and so forth. So these sliders are responsible for like an opacity, for intensity of these effects, these controls that we are doing to the curves. The next section is called soft clip. As you can see, it is also linked together, and I'm going to demonstrate what it does by dragging, for example, this low to the right. As you can see, it increases the level at which our image is going to clip. Everything that is reaching this level is going to be crushed, it's going to be clipped. And this is actually a peculiar thing, because I'm going to show you what it can do, and it can lead you to something that is really, really bad. If I drag my lift down and crush in shadows, as you can see, I'm losing some information within my shadows. If I create another node and increase the shadows back again, this information is retrieved. So it is not lost. But if I drag this slider from low to the right, thus crushing my shadows, the information is lost. I can no longer retrieve my information no matter what I do. So be careful when you're using this slider. I would suggest using not low and high. High is doing pretty much the same thing, but to the highlights. I would recommend using low soft and high soft. These controls, they are going to compress any information that is reaching a certain point. For example, I've crushed my shadows, but I'm comfortable with the amount of contrast. I just want some of the information back. I'm going to increase low soft to a certain amount, thus bringing some of the information back. The DaVinci is going to compress everything that is reaching below this level, and it's going to reveal some of the information that is actually lost in the shadows after my corrections. You can also unlink it and apply a certain effect to a certain color, but be careful. If you overdo it, it's not going to look natural, it's not going to look good. Now let's have a look at the other curves that we have in here. The first one, or the second one after the main one, is called hue versus hue. It means that you can select any hue that you have in your image and change it to another hue. You can either click it with your eyedropper tool in here. By the way, you can do the same thing in your curves. You can just click in here and it's going to put a point on your line, and you've got separate points for luminance and for colors. You can just drag one point that is responsible for luminance, and because all of our channels are linked, it's going to be affecting everything at the same time. If I wanted to correct it separately, I'd unlink them, and because I have different points for different colors and for luminance, I would know exactly where this point is. So let's move to the next hue versus hue. By selecting a certain area, it's going to put a point and a couple of points on the left and on the right that are going to restrict this area. This way I can change any color to a different one. Let's put a dot somewhere on this wall. Yeah? Now I'm changing the color of the wall to something completely different. The next curve is called hue versus saturation. It allows you to increase saturation of a certain particular color. For example, I can click in here and increase the saturation only of the color that I need. You can click down below at a certain color, and it's going to put a dot in a wide area because you're selecting the whole color, rather than just using eyedropper tool to select the color that you want within your scene. By the way, it's going to result in a very interesting effect once you apply hue versus hue and hue versus saturation simultaneously within the same node. I'm going to show you what I mean. If you select a certain color and using hue versus hue, you're going to change this color to, for example, pink one, and then you want to increase the saturation of this pink color, but without changing the node. We're going to do it within the same node. Because this node receives the information from the initial image, it does not treat this color as pink. So if I try to increase the saturation of pink, it is not going to work because it fits the same color. But once I click on the wall, it's going to show me absolutely the same color as hue versus hue, which is kind of orange. And I can increase the saturation, which looks like pink because we changed this color, but it actually is pink. But if I create a second node and I'm going to use eyedropper tool or my picker to select this color, it now shows me that it is actually pink because I selected second node and the information is being fed from the previous node. That's why the order in which you create your nodes actually important. Okay. Now let's move to the next one, which is hue versus luminance. So you can increase the brightness of certain parts which are connected by a certain hue. Now let's go to the next one, luminance versus saturation. So you can control the luminance of certain parts, or better say the saturation. Yeah, the correct way to say, you can control the saturation of certain parts depending on the luminance. So why it is actually useful? Because you can create a black point and a white point. It is going to create a point separating your shadows from the midtones and separating your highlights from the midtones. And I'm going to demonstrate it by creating something ridiculous. For example, I'm going to push it to something like reddish, orangey color, and I'm going to increase saturation to something absolutely ridiculous. And now by creating these points that are going to separate my shadows from the midtones and the highlights from the midtones, I'm going to reduce saturation within these areas. By reducing this point, I'm going to clean my shadows. My shadows are becoming neutral because I'm reducing saturation to 0 within my shadows. You can fine-tune and control it in here, but it's actually a good way to remove any color from your shadows. The same thing goes to the highlights. Look at this area. The light that is coming from here is completely reddish orangey color, but I want it to become white. So what do? I reduce this point to 0, and now it turns at least the portion of it into white. This way you can clean up your highlights and your shadows. A very useful curve. Now the next one, saturation versus saturation. It means that this portion represents the least saturated parts of the image, and this portion represents the most saturated parts. This way you can boost only the least saturated parts, increase their saturation, and reduce the saturation of parts that are already oversaturated. And the last one is called saturation versus luminance. It is almost the same thing as this one, luminance versus saturation, but it is flipped. So what does it mean? I can increase the luminance of certain parts depending on the saturation. So these are the least saturated parts, these are the most saturated parts, and I can control the luminance of them within this image using these curves. For example, let's increase saturation. This part is not so saturated. Yeah, it's giving me this point, and I can increase the luminance only of this portion. And this way you can control your image perfectly. So these are all the curves that you can find within DaVinci Resolve, the main curves that you need to control to color grade your image. Typically, after the main color grading, you are going to fine-tune any color, any luminance value that you need within these curves. Thank you everybody for watching. In the next lesson, we're going to have a closer look at the color warper, what it does, what you can do with it, what settings you need to use. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.